All right, we're starting pretty much right on time here. Made a good schedule. Good schedule. Okay, so I've got all the questions. Of course, after I asked for questions, I kind of got mobbed up here because everybody had the same question. It was for you, John. You left us waiting for an answer on the count, the story, unended.
Okay, so why does a blood-sucking vampire teach your children to count? And what does he have to do with elderberries? These are all intertwined. So go back with me. Imagine you are in Western Europe, the Dark Ages, and it is a credible threat that instead of Joe Biden coming through the window to sniff your children, a vampire is going to come through the window and, try and suck one of the blood of somebody in your family. How are you going to stop a vampire? But why? So, what are the weaknesses of vampires?
Garlic.
Sunlight, garlic, holy water, stake through the heart. Do you know what is the oldest, earliest attested weakness of vampires? Obsessed. How did you know that? Oh, yeah. That's cheating, but it's true. So one of the earliest known weaknesses of vampires in Western European literature is obsessive compulsive counting disorder. And so that is why this is like when you're overqualified for the job. They're like, I write characters for Sesame Street, and I have like a PhD in Western European monsters of darkness. So that's why vampires and counting go together.
I think somebody learned sharing from Sesame Street. They had a whole song, sharing, sharing. I had a friend of my mom's who said, they're communists. They're trying to teach your children communism by having them share. I don't know about that.
Okay, good. All right, well, moving on. Okay, folks want to know, when you look in the Old Testament, especially reading through Judges, you see, here's a glimmer of hope. This judge is good. Here's a faithful man. He's bringing the nation back to God. And then, of course, you turn the page and we see Israel doing the same, falling back into unfaithfulness. The question was this: what can we do to persevere and preserve generational fidelity? So we're seeking to gain ground here that was gained for us years before, but we've lost it due to, maybe the evangeli spine that we were hearing about. What do we do to hold that fidelity and carry it on faithfully to the next generation?
Not all at once, please.
Before I answer the question, I have to recommend the book. The other book I was going to recommend, this is about the Two Kingdom Theology by Willem Ouweneel. I had a hand in this book, editing it. It's called The World is Christ's, a critique of Two Kingdoms theology. This is as good, if not better, than John Frame's book. This is very, very accessible. The world is Christ's. Answering the question about preserving intergenerational fidelity, I have a number of possible answers, but the one that comes to the top, catechesis. Catechesis is an old word that refers to teaching children to answer questions of the faith. Part of the productivity of the Reformation was the production of numerous catechisms. Heidelberg Catechism, Westminster Catechism, the Helvetic Confessions, and so on. Question and answer format. I think the church needs to make catechism instruction a priority. Sunday school, in my opinion, is odd man out for this calling. Catechesis.
We need to abolish the public school system. So if we think we had generations of faithful Christians in America, which I think we have, and that there was a point in time, maybe prior to the last 70 years or so, where before things really went insane, what has happened? Well, multiple generations have been brainwashed by the Darwinists, by the progressives, by the gender theorists, and look what we're getting now. And so, look, obviously I'm probably preaching to the choir here in terms of that concept, but I think Christians in general need to become much more unapologetic in calling for things like that. I spent 10 years in a church that, otherwise great statement of faith, expositional preaching, meaningful membership, but questions of like, do you send your kids to private school or Christian school or homeschool or public school? It's just sort of like, what's the word? Ideaphora, like just over to individuals' consciences, and we're not going to bind anybody on that. I'm like, maybe we should start binding people's conscience on that one.
This is the question that has haunted Christianity for a long time, the Christendom, right? We have the Puritans, we have our fathers, and the reason they even came to the United States was so they would not lose their children. A few years ago, I got to go to this conference with one of my elders, and it was in the middle of Tennessee, and it was like we got off the interstate, we got off the regular road, we got off the paved road, onto the gravel road, onto the grass road, and we pulled into this compound. And there were a bunch of guys with guns standing outside, and I said, well, if we get in there and there's white sheets, we're out of here, okay? But we got there, and they brought up at the conference a study that they had done on homeschool. And they had studied multiple generations, and they found that this generation homeschooled the next generation, but the next generation did not homeschool. And so that was like the broad study. And so what was the conclusion? Well, they went and did a little more digging, and they found out that those who homeschooled their children and then taught their children the reason why, which was for the love of God and the glory of God, their children actually continued it until the next generation. And I think there's a principle from that is it's not enough that we teach our children what we're doing, we have to teach them why. If you go back and you think of the greatest generation and some of the people in our fathers, they were very moral people. They loved God, and then they taught their children to be moral, but they didn't teach them why. And then that next generation was pretty moral, but they did not even teach their children to be moral. And then the generation after that, well, you're here, right? And they don't even know what morality is. So I think the answer is why. And then one more thing. The thing I learned most from my dad and mom was to love the church. My oldest memory of the church was getting ready to go to church, and they told us we're going to church, and it wasn't Sunday, and it wasn't Wednesday, it was Tuesday. This is unusual. And we got there, and the parking lot was full, which was pretty amazing. It was full. Then we get in there, and there was this big hush. It felt like a funeral. And while we're sitting there, in walks the pastor. The pastor actually was not supposed to be there. They were there to get rid of him. And he walks up and got in front, and he gave a speech defending himself because he was trying to. The reason they were getting rid of him, he had disciplined the piano player for divorcing her husband, who was her third husband. And they were getting rid of him. So he defends himself, rebukes them, wipes the dust off his feet, and walks out. Half the church laughed, half the church cried, and I was scared to death. And I love the church. I love the church because my parents, we didn't stay at that church. We went. But that church began to repent. And you know what? We went back. Even though it was imperfect. And that has always played a part in my life. my parents taught me, love the church. It's messy, it's difficult, and yet that love that my dad has for it, we don't agree on baptism and other things, but man, I know my dad loved the church, and I love the church. And I hope to teach my children to love the church.
Thank you, guys. One question that was asked was, if you could get a single book recommendation to the hands of our young people today, outside of the Bible, what would you recommend right now?
I'm gonna stick with the Boniface option. That's pretty good. I'm assuming they're being catechized and learning the faith, but as far as worldview and, you know, Schaeffer's pretty big. I always called Schaeffer as Kuyper for dummies, and all my friends said, I can't even read Schaeffer, he's too complicated. So I would say Boniface option because in it, Andrew Isker pulls absolutely no punches in describing A, the world as it is, B, what it means to take the axe to the root of the oak. And he describes it in so many things we would just say, this is basic common sense, following Jesus in your family and your household, things of that nature. But he says every time you do these things, you're one more stroke to that oak tree that represents idolatry and tranny and gay and everything that's just insane. It literally is insane. And then he gives a solution. It's always wrapped up in the gospel and how the gospel has positive benefits and this worldly achievements. So, yeah.
I don't have a book. Oh, you mean like recommend what I was like? I'm not Stephen Wolf. Yeah, I mean, I feel stumped. That's what it's like. If you have one, I don't know. You know, like it's interesting. Like if you'd asked me this question maybe like 3 or 4 years ago, I would have said something probably along the lines of like Evangelism and the Sovereignty of God by J.I. Packer, or like Knowing God by J.I. Packer, you know, or something like that. But I do wonder, just as Tim's referencing the Boniface option, if like what young people really need is a more like fresh and relevant orientation to the lives that they're living right now in angry trash clown world. So I don't know, maybe you know, here I'll make a recommendation. This is not one that a lot of people recommend, but it's been really helpful for me actually, and it's very practical. It's called Big God by Orlando Sayre, and he addresses the sovereignty of God in suffering, prayer, decision making, and one other category, and it was very useful for me. So Big God by Orlando Sayre. It's a good book.
Just a quick note, I just got my son reading that last week, so there we go.
So I'm going to assume that your children are in theologically sound churches already reading books like this. So especially when dealing with young men, having to navigate the world we find them in, what men especially generally lack is a way to navigate vocation, asset accumulation, income stuff, especially in our circles. And I don't think their parents realize what a issue this is becoming, because you know, there is a recent study, I think Bloomberg ran the article, where it was like 62%, it was some absurd number of Fortune 500 companies are purposely no longer hiring white males. So I would recommend books along the lines of like Tim Ferriss's 4-Hour Work Week. Because if your boys are theologically sound, you know, theology is not going to be their problem. Feeding their family is going to be a problem. And we really as a church need to get ahead of the curve on solving this economic issue that is afflicting our congregants. You know, like, you know, William says, hey guys, you need to chase the girl. But where are they going to live right now? Housing in the U.S. has never been less affordable. The cost of housing to income ratio right now is literally the worst it has been in like 150 years. Meaning like, and that's just like how much time they can actually track it based on numbers. So practically speaking, especially for young men, both the church as a whole and then the families of the churches really need to be thinking, how do we give them skills that will let them take on a girl and then actually provide and have children?
I don't know if I can top any of that, but since you went non-theological, I was going to do that and recommend Jocko Willink's Extreme Ownership is another one with that I would recommend. But then I just think a Christian needs a good foundation, and so I would encourage you just to pick up the Westminster Confession of Faith or the 1689 and read through that and do some Bible studies through that. Do the catechisms, start there, get John Calvin's Institutes and read that. That's how I became a Calvinist, is with John Calvin's Institutes. So you can't go wrong with that.
I second Calvin's Institutes.
Do I hear a motion?
All right, I think on that note, what's the right balance, or that might be the wrong word, but what's the right balance between intellectualism, having a clear mind, being trained, being educated, seminary, that kind of thing, in contrast to what we heard about the early church, uneducated men, common men. I think, for example, of, my grandpa. He went to 3rd grade. He was a man saved in his 30s. He was from a Mennonite background. God saved him after that, and he became a stalwart of Christ. But he was not a reader. He wasn't a very educated man, and yet a very passionate Christian, and he made it very clear for his love for Christ. I very much admired his simplicity, the simplicity of his clarity and his thinking. I also admire great intellects well used. So what's the right pursuit of that? I know, John, you mentioned, for parents teaching their boys, like areas of emphasis on, do we get the Latin in, or do we get the, swordsmanship under our belt? So just maybe speak to that to some extent, that balance.
I made a suggestion in my presentation about producing a parallel culture. I think one example of the parallel culture is stop sending our kids to universities and colleges that are directed by humanists and demanding certain behaviors and thought patterns in order to get the diploma after you're thousands of dollars in debt. One of my heroes has been Francis Schaeffer's model of L'Abri. And I think we need to pray. We need to pray, work, and give for the creation of L'Abri in America, where people who are curious, intellectually thirsty, can go to get mentored and modeled in the faith as it applies to culture. Francis Schaeffer's L'Abri model, I think, is one of the best balances between intellectual pursuit and hands in the dirt application.
So one of the first things I'll say is seminary education is no guarantee of some of the dumbest people I've met I went to seminary with. So, I mean, I wouldn't trust them with a Q-tip, let alone pastoring a church. We're a society where as soon as we see somebody has credentials, we assume they have competence. And this is a dangerous assumption, especially when the people who hold the credentials in our society openly hate God. What does Proverbs say? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And this is one reason our medical system, so many of the institutions that were formerly trustworthy and sound, as they've moved away from the fear of God, which is what made them sound originally, they're no longer sound. They're Egypt, like it says in the prophets. Don't put your hand on Egypt, that reed that's going to pierce your hand. So we need to move away from this model. I think we also just need to say, when it comes to our children and the balance, we need to see how they're bent. You know, some of us have kids who are going to be very intellectually gifted. They need pushed into more martial directions. Like, I have my son Noah, super sweet kid. He would be nothing but a bookworm if we let him. He would be like, you know, taking apart the car and reading books, and that would be his whole life. So he really, really needs the judo. Now my son Caleb, every single conference we go to, he fights somebody at, because he loves that martial. And Caleb is physically gifted. He's very handsome, just saying for the girls in the crowd or dads with daughters, and a super hard-working guy. So we have to push him on the intellectual side a bit more than we have to for some of the other kids. And so as a parent, and then as a community, you're going to have men and women who are gifted in different directions, and that's good, as long as the people who are gifted one direction do what Paul teaches in Corinthians, and the hand doesn't look at the feet and say, I don't need you, and the feet don't look at the hands and say, well, I'm better than you.
I think on that question, you know, I do like the idea of, you know, trying to encourage men to be warrior poets. You know, that's sort of like an Athenian ideal, and you know, and it captures both sides of what John's getting at here. You know, it's like the martial, physical side, the intellectual, you know, educational side, and you'll have a different balance between all men. You know, I have 3 boys, and already my 5-year-old is, I mean, he is just brilliant. And my 3-year-old, who is also smart, but also just like a little ball of like athletic muscle and energy. And like I can see already the varying degrees between them. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that I would agree with John, having just recently finished seminary and having spent 10 years in Washington, D.C., that some of the most incompetent people you'll ever meet are some of the most credentialed people you'll ever encounter. And so credentialing, and in America, we've definitely skewed towards an overemphasis of credentialism that I think we're beginning to come out of some. So all that to say, I think that, you know, intellectual formation in the Christian life should always be for 2 purposes. One is for knowing and defending the truth. You should never let intellectual formation be an excuse for like beginning to slip on the basics of the Bible, and far too often it is that. And then second, it should be for truth applied in practical ways, primarily in the local church. So if you have men that are pursuing seminary education or things like that, or your boys or whatever, like the point is to apply it in the church and in real life.
I'll just add this, if you remember during the Rona years, how the specialists were treated as almost the Plato's intellectual gods of the society. They had the word salad, and if you would even just deign to challenge one or any of the preconceived narratives, they'll point you to the word salad, point you to the specialist. Well, are you a physionuclear liation? I made that. Well, no. Well, then how could you possibly know anything? I'm like, well, I know this. I'm not getting that shot because you'll die, you know. So that's one of the idols, I believe, if Schlossberg was writing today, he would say the idol of specialization and word salad after your name. So, yeah, I mean, I like the idea. I was talking to Darren. Wave, so good to see you, brother. He did show up. He's got bronchitis like the rest of us. Well, we were talking, and I said, I've never gone to college. I mean, I have a high school diploma. Then I went, and Jethro was going to be a rock star. And then I got saved, and I kept reading books. And so nothing there. But there's got to be a goal, and I think that's exactly right what William said. There's got to be a goal to your intellectual pursuits that is kingdom-driven, and you're looking to apply those wonderful truths of the Bible to all of life, and that goes to what Nelson was talking about. There needs to be this broader knowledge base, like a good Christian apologist. You're not going to be left surprised. And if you don't know something, be a man, admit it, say, well, I don't know anything about that. I can't tell. Can we talk about something else?
Okay, I'm going to ask one other question, but I want to maybe to have you guys be thinking about one question you want to ask one other panel member. Okay? Okay. Here's a question for Joseph. How come I couldn't think of your first name for a second? How do we decide what Twitter battles are worth getting into? And
you asked that. He asked that, didn't he?
No. Okay. and tagged on to that, what's the balance between looking for stuff to criticize out there somewhere and also not neglecting to look in here and in our families and in our churches and addressing those issues very head on?
I'm not sure it's a matter of picking which battles that I would argue it is, as far as on Twitter. I think social media is a tool that godly men need to be able to use. It is a public square. Christians have always engaged in the public square. I'm on social media, but I also know my proclivities to be on social media and think I'm accomplishing something when I'm not necessarily. It's not to say that you can't accomplish something with it, but I know my personal proclivities to know that I have actual battles that I need to face as a father, a pastor, a husband, and I can give myself victories on Twitter or social or Facebook and not be fighting the battles that I need to fight in front of me. Let me just say this. It's incredibly easy for any person to build up a following on social media. I got 5,000 followers on Facebook. I maxed it out. I got actually 7,000. I maxed out the friends. Dude, I'm just a pastor in southern Indiana, right? So if I can do it, anybody can do it. You just, and the problem that can become with that is you can then, how to give the people that follow you what they want to hear, right? Scratching the ears. Those temptations are in Scripture. So these are dangers of social media. And I've met people that have had large followings on social media, and I had a picture in my mind of what this person was going to be like. This is going to be like the toughest, guy that's got it all straight. And then when I meet the person, their family's in shambles, and they are just a dork. I wouldn't trust them with a Q-tip, like he says, right? And then I've met people that have followings on social media, and they're the real thing. So my exhortation then is judge your heart, judge yourself. Know thyself, right? And what are you doing? Are you wasting time on here? One of the ways you can know if you're wasting time is your cell phone will tell you how many hours you've spent, right? And then have a sense of proportion. Have a sense of proportion with it that, all right, you just slammed Owen Stratton, man. You really owned him and good. And he needs to be owned, but you owned him great, okay? This little midget dude. And, okay, but what did that accomplish in the grand scheme of things? It might have been an accomplishment, but, you got likes. So just have the sense of proportionate. This is a tool that we ought to use and be a part of, but don't mistake it for the battle itself. A part of the battle, not the battle. Right? If you're bold on Facebook, but you can't tell your wife no, you can't discipline your children, or me as a pastor can't look at one of my elders and tell them they're wrong, I'm not bold, man. It's what you said about the fighting the battle anywhere but the right battle. And so that's my long answer. I hope I answered all of it. I don't know if I did.
I think that was very helpful. Okay. Tim, do you want to start? Ask one other person a question.
I want to.
And let's just keep, for time's sake, let's just keep that question is for that person. So
Exactly.
yeah.
Right. So I haven't really thought about it. So here we go. I'll just off the cuff. I've never done that before. Yeah. William, 4 years with the mean tweet guy. And you said you work with a lot of incompetent people as well. What qualities did the competent people have that were noticeable and made them rise above the incompetent herd in the swamp?
Okay, so like, what did a good bureaucrat look like? So I worked at the State Department and the Department of Defense. State was worse than DOD, and there weren't many good folks. So the first thing that immediately came to mind was if there was that anybody who I could try to think of who was better than the rest of the paper pushers was probably somebody who had a little bit of epistemological humility. Like these people, they particularly in the State Department, these foreign service officers who, come from the elite echelons of American society, and they've passed the Foreign Service exam, and they cycle through their different postings every 2 years, so they're truly a multicultural, global citizen of the world here to steer the benighted American foreign policy on behalf of all you chuds, and so they are very proud people. And they disdain, middle America in so many ways. And so I think that, if I were to work with good bureaucrats in the time that I did, they were probably humble people who recognized that they didn't know everything. And humble, and then also people who were willing to change. So the gears of government just grind in the same direction, and we just keep funding this thing because we funded this thing, and we've always funded this thing, so we got to fund this thing. And Trump did in many ways. The first Secretary of State, Tillerson, had this 30% budget reduction to the State Department that didn't go anywhere. But if I could see, in a foreign service officer or civil servant, a flexibility to think maybe we could do something differently. Then I was like, oh wow, that's one in 100. Oh, I'm asking a question. Yeah. John. Yeah, John Moody. Why are you the way that you are?
Can I get a definition?
John, you just have a very interesting sort of personality palette. So I'm sure on behalf of many people here, we'd be interested, what were some sort of defining influences on you growing up that has made you this renegade Renaissance man?
Yeah. My poor wife. Because anytime anybody asks her, what I do for a living, she just generally, mumbles something and hopes they don't hear me. So I did not grow up a believer. So I grew up an altar boy in the Catholic Church, went to a Catholic school. Then I got punted into public school. In a real sense, I'm from a city called Youngstown, Ohio, which isn't just part of the Rust Belt, it became a black hole. Rusted away, became a black hole of just destruction. And the Lord saved me after my mother died my sophomore year of college. So I had just in many ways, I was like a child of the moral, economic, spiritual decline of America, all rolled together in a single place. And then the Lord saved me out of that black hole. And that was just very because again, I never grew up in Christian circles, so I never had the preloaded operating system of the guys I met in churches and the guys I met at seminary. And so that helped me a lot have a very different demeanor and personality. And then I was fortunate, after the Lord saved me, I was immediately discipled by a 6'4" African-American pastor named David Gray. Dude was like 280 pounds, just one of the big, and he immediately, you know, so the first church I went to after being saved was a 100% African-American church with 5 of us white kids from Youngstown State University would go to on Sunday mornings. And that was, you know, so I've always had these kind of counterweighting experiences in my life. And then, you know, like my undergraduate, I started college as a chemistry major. I was a math major for a time and decided I didn't want to become a Unabomber. So I became a business finance major. And then I immediately went to seminary for pastoral work. And then after seminary, I spent 2.5 years doing classics in ancient Near Eastern history. And then I became a homesteader. And so I have like this completely schizophrenic educational background. But I've dealt with almost every type of person over the course of those 15 years. I interned at my school's foundation and sat on investment meetings with guys with 8- and 9-digit net worths managing money. And I've sat in fields butchering chickens. And so I just, you know, this is one thing I've tried to do for my kids. I want them to have this wide taste of what life is really like. A lot of us live in a very narrow circle of life. So like the guys in the State Department, they live in that artificial world of the State Department. And white-collar guys tend to live in this white-collar world. And I've been fortunate that through Providence, there's very few parts of life I have not gotten to taste. And so it's just made me, you know, just strange.
This question is for John. I'm going to ask you to tell us another story about holy mockery that you've engaged in. But while you're thinking about the story, I want to recommend my 2 favorite theologians, and this also speaks to young people, and they are Calvin and Hobbes. Calvin and Hobbes, now you have to read them with discernment, but Calvin is the hero of every 6-year-old and has managed in his, Bill Watterson, of course, is the creator of the syndicated column, but I have the 3 volumes, hardback volumes of Calvin and Hobbes, and you'll come across stunning biblical theology at certain points in Calvin and Hobbes. So I recommend that highly for children and young people to be read under parent supervision. Now, John, can you tell us another story?
Sure. So, you know, so starting in the late 1990s, the federal government decided to wage a war on local farmers and anything outside of like the Kroger, Costco food distribution system. So this went on into the early 2010s. A small group of us got together and we decided, hey, what would be better fun than trying to get ourselves arrested? Because if they're arresting us, they won't be arresting our farmers. So we began to do targeted acts of open civil disobedience. And this culminated with, we decided to do a raw milk and cookie day on the footsteps of the FDA in Maryland. And so we had like 400 or 500 people show up. We brought raw milk illegally from Pennsylvania to Silver Springs, Maryland. But the best part was my friend Max Kane goes, well, this doesn't mean anything unless they know we're coming. So for 5 months before the event, every like Tuesday morning, and Max recorded himself doing this. It's utterly hilarious video. So it's Max calling the FDA in Silver. And he goes, hi, this is Max Kane again. Is John Sheehan in? He's not in again? How strange. Does this guy even work here anymore? So just, and he's like, well, we just want to remind John Sheehan that on such and such a date, we want to invite him. And hey, since I talk to you so much, we want to invite you too to raw milk and cookies at the FDA. And so we did this for months, just basically openly goading them to engage with us. And on the day we get to the FDA, one whole side of road that leads to the FDA is Department of Homeland Security. You think it was a BLM riot, but you know, mostly peaceful protests. And the other side is all Silver Springs police. And no one from the FDA came out to interact with us. But the very next day, they issued a letter rescinding one of their major policies targeting people. So it was highly effective to openly goad them. And when they wouldn't interact with us, they now had no ground to go after people over this issue. Because if they were not going to go after us, 400 people who publicly mocked them for months, and then illegally brought raw milk from Pennsylvania and distributed it on the footsteps of the FDA, how are they going to go after anyone else at this point? So, Tim, this is the 4th year?
Yeah.
So, what is your biggest, you know, when you started this event, what was your biggest hope for what this event would do for people who came? You know, it's like when you said, like, I'm going to do an event. This is what I really hope, you know, for the average dad, the average mom, when they came here, what were you hoping this would do for them that they weren't going to get somewhere else, or what you thought would really help them?
That's a good question. So it was 2020. There's an election going on, and it's the middle of September, and I thought, you know, I have an awful lot of friends in this local area. I mean, I've grown up here, I live here, raised my family here, I still live here, and I pastor here. And I have a whole bunch of contacts with people that are ostensibly, like we would say, they're good folks, you know, they're conservative. Even my old hippie friends from the 70s are conservatives, right? They recognize insanity when they see it, and they don't like tyranny. That's how it is. And I thought, well, why don't we do something, for the church primarily, to put some of these ideas out there. See, in 2018, I preached a series called Jesus and Politics, and it covered a wide variety of things, all things cultural, biblical justice, where I can't remember who was talking about equal weights in the bag, and, you know, just basic stuff, right? So that was kind of the idea for the first year, just to inform, awaken, edify the church, because sometimes people think like what we've heard today, where they don't want to be involved in that. Or the worst one I heard was what I mentioned in my talk was about diluting the gospel by being active in any other sphere but the church as a pastor. Now, many of these two kingdom guys, what's your favorite one? NL2. Okay. I'm going to honor my esteemed guest, NL2K. What they will do is they'll say, oh no, we're perfectly fine with the average Christian doing things, being involved, but not anyone who would represent the church institution. So it's always kind of a get out of jail free card. Oh, I can't do that. I'm the pastor, you know. So I just want to take a weekend, a Saturday, and it was all last minute. You know, you're supposed to plan these things months in advance. Well, this was like 40 days. And we had a nice turnout. And in fact, a number of the people that were at the first one let me know this year, and it was like 4 big families, that they were all going to be out of town visiting their new grandbaby and stuff like that. So that was really the goal. Just let's put these ideas out there. These are all on the table for discussion, the kind of involvement that average, normal Christians can exercise and still maintain, well, in fact, it would be part of maintaining a healthy testimony for the lordship and kingly authority of Jesus Christ. That's it.
I initially wanted to ask Mr. Wolf what the strangest critique of his Christian nationalist book is, but no, Doctor, it's Nelson, right? Yes. You gave a good critique of, you called it NL2K or R2K. My question is, what is your take on classical two kingdoms? And that does relate to Stephen Wolf's book on Christian nationalism. And so I'd just be curious your take on that.
Well, part of the answer takes us back to Augustine. Augustine worked with two cities, the city of God, the city of man. And these two cities were irreconcilable. So there we do have a separation. And he said, you've got to be a member of one or the other, but you can't be a member of both. Well, that raised, in the early church, as you well know, that raised a serious question about, may I serve in the army? May I serve as a military soldier? And that gave Christians a big headache. So they had to answer that. And as history moved on, now you get Martin Luther. And Martin Luther is the one whose law-gospel division led to the two kingdoms, one of God's right hand, one of God's left hand. And for Luther, these two, though he was better than his theology, these two were sort of separated and irreconcilable too. He wanted a Christian prince, though. He did argue and plead for a Christian prince, which I say is better than his theology. John Calvin, as you know, in Geneva, and this is what I don't get of the Westminster, California guys. John Calvin preached a series of sermons on Deuteronomy, and in these sermons, he pleaded for the application of God's law to the life of Geneva. You can't tell me that John Calvin didn't integrate, that's my word, integrate the kingdom of the sacred, call it the church, call it special revelation in the Bible, with the kingdom of the world, that is life in the world. So the classic reformational doctrine of two kingdoms is what I call the integrationist model of, thank you, Kuiper, sphere sovereignty. Yeah. Sphere sovereignty. Don't let the church issue speeding tickets, but don't let the state close the church. By the way, you know, we do not want to re-ecclesiasticize life. See, under Roman Catholicism, all of life was under the church. The Reformation freed us from that. We don't want to go back to that. Unfortunately, this church-state debate, this church-state thing of Daryl Hart, misses a very important linchpin, and that is, I'm in favor of the separation of church and state, but not the separation of religion and the state. All states are religious by nature. Daryl Hart refuses to acknowledge that. So that's where they go off the road.
Okay, let's just take a couple more questions. We'll just make these like for one person, just for brevity. These were questions that were submitted. When running for a political post, do we run as independent or for a particular party? What's your recommendation? Maybe we'll give this one to you, William.
Yeah, but I don't think that there's really no viable third-party system in the United States of America right now. So just run as a Republican and just be the absolute best Christian Republican candidate that you could possibly imagine yourself to be, which is what my good friend Dusty Devers has recently done in Oklahoma, Southwest Oklahoma, District 32. He's won his primary to be, a state senator there, and talk about a Christian prince. So yeah, don't run independent. That's silly. Don't do that.
Tim, I'll give this one to you. Should churches be 501c3? Why or why not?
No.
Why not?
Okay. Oh, I have to answer that second part. Oh, great. Okay. This is not a deal breaker. It doesn't mean that the churches compromise who are incorporated. However, when we planted a church, me and this guy right here and a bunch of other families, we looked into this in as much detail as we could. The IRS book on church tax law was about that thick, remember? Big, thick, a lot of words. That's a word salad. The upshot was that no IRS agent could give you any decent answer to the question. And they would basically say, well, I don't know why you guys are incorporating. You're already a non-taxed entity. I think that's the correct term. So I would say, if this was a not trash world we live in, it wouldn't be any big deal because now you're going to protect yourself from lawsuits. That's the answer I get from my SBC betters. is that, well, it protects you in case someone slips on the ice on your sidewalk. But I really don't see any real purpose to be putting your church under the authority of the state of Indiana for no reason at all, other than it's kind of cool and hip. And why do we think we went from plurality of elders to a pastor and a board? Well, it looks a lot like a worldly corporation at that point. So, yeah, I don't think there's really any reason. That's all right.
Pass it down. I want to hear the alternative.
Well, this will be fun. We've all been in agreement on everything. So, we planted our church. We were not. We incorporated to be able to own property and have a bank account. We were not 501c3. But what we found was that we're losing money that's going to taxes. Not that they're taxing us. We don't get a tax bill from the government. But when I go to the store to buy something for the church, I'm giving money that's already been taxed to the hilts to be taxed again that belongs to the Lord. So we recently filed for 501c3. And I know people say, like you said, that you might be compromised or you're afraid you won't speak to politics. Well, here I am, and they can come take it away. All right. If we will stand firm on the Word of God and what it says and speak to this realm, and if they want to take it away, they would come take it whether we had it or not. And so we have to fight for that. But it's in my opinion that the civil government should give tax breaks to the church and should protect the church and do all the things that are in the Belgian Confession and the Westminster Confession of faith. So that's why. But we're brothers. We love each other, and yeah, I don't care really.
Quick question, follow-up, kind of random. Give it to you, and then I want to hear William. What percentage of Southern Baptist pastors do you think, secretly or not, read Doug Wilson?
Me? I'm not Southern Baptist, but, I was Southern Baptist, and I read Doug Wilson, yes. So I know a whole lot do.
A lot.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know, like 60, 70%.
Okay. All right, I think we're gonna wrap it up there. We've got a few closing remarks yet, so thank you, man.
Yeah. Everyone, let's give all of our speakers and our MC a big round of applause. We're gonna take a picture when we're all done after this.